Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. This is Doing Virtue. I'm your host, Anthony Criste, here with one of my co-hosts, Brian Hicks. The other co-host he's not here. He quit the podcast. He's not coming. So, no, he's actually out of town. But we are going to podcast nonetheless. And today we have a guest on the show, one of our college friends from the same class, philosophy major, and a construction worker extraordinaire, Mr. Anthony VanAlstine. Anthony, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, I traveled all the way out from Omaha to be on the podcast.
Yeah,
Let's go.
So officially, he is the guest who has traveled the farthest. First it was Father Stokes from Pennsylvania. Now we have someone who came all the way out from Omaha, Nebraska, just to be on the show.
Nothing else going on.
There's not a wedding this weekend that he has to leave for in a couple hours.
There's not a wedding today.
Definitely not today. So anyway, but we're happy to have him on the show. And I am going to have Anthony give a little background about himself. So for anyone listening who doesn't already know who Anthony is, I'm just going to put him on the spot and make him give a several-minute bio, and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure to listen to you guys, so it's nice to be on and talk to y'all again. It's been a while. So my name's Anthony VanAlstine. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. I was born in Augusta, Georgia, which, for those who don't know, that's basically if you draw a line from the upstate of the South Carolina-Georgia border to the coast. We're about right in the middle there, right on the South Carolina-Georgia border. Lived there for 10 years, and then I moved to South Carolina, Aiken, South Carolina, right across the border. Lived there till I came up to Christendom when I was 18, so we lived there for 8 years, and then I stayed here for a year after graduation, and then moved out to Omaha, Nebraska, which, for those who don't know, it's basically Iowa, just on the west side of the Missouri River, you know.
The important thing is that it's basically Iowa.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I was homeschooled for all of my growing up years. And then came to Christendom. I guess the path that kind of led me to Christendom, I knew about Christendom most of my life, having done Mother Divine Grace and Seton, especially Seton, since they're just down the street from Christendom. I was very familiar. I also had a lot of people. I had an aunt who had graduated Christendom. She had family and other people I knew that had gone to Christendom. So I've kind of known about Christendom most of my life, and it was kind of high up on my list of colleges to attend if when I decided to go to college and all. I guess what really led me to Christendom, though, specifically is I attended the summer program and just really, really loved the classes that we had, really loved the people, the professors, and just the community, especially what I've seen in their flyers and what I'd seen in visiting. It just was something I really wanted to be a part of. It's a small college, even... just a lot of other colleges, you look at Benedictine, you look at Ave, they've got way more students, and I just really was drawn to the smaller student body size. And as Anthony said, I majored in philosophy, where I wrote a thesis on fatherhood and as kind of the, not really, I guess the embodiment, the fulfillment of the masculine identity, kind of drawing on Thomistic and Aristotelian thought to help kind of prove and show that. And then all through college, and really even through high school, I'd done construction work, and through college I did construction work part-time for a local Catholic company here in Front Royal. And then after I moved to Omaha, I also continued working construction, where I'm now a superintendent for a commercial company. And so I've just been in the trades most of my life. So a lot of people wonder why I majored in philosophy and ended up in construction. Get a lot of strange looks, especially from a lot of my secular coworkers, but...
And I assume you always respond, that's a really good question. So I think Aquinas would say, let me just pull out this Aristotle.
Well, there's philosophy and there's philososophy.
There's construction and then there's construction. So that was actually one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, beyond the fact that it would just be awesome to have a friend on the show and just talk about the good life and all the things that are entailed with that. But as of right now, I don't think we've really had a show that's specifically on fatherhood, and I'm hoping we'll probably have more of them. But you're a new father to a beautiful child of whom I am the godfather to. So she's never going to do anything wrong, and if she does, it's not really my fault. And
Blame it on Kathleen.
We'll blame it on the godmother if she takes when she goes through her terrible 2 stage. I'd kind of been thinking about who to have on to talk about fatherhood, and I know there's honestly a lot of priests that could come on and talk very intelligently about it, but they wouldn't be able to talk about it in a not that they would be able to talk about it in an intelligent way, but not in a way that's based on practically living that life of fatherhood, in at least in terms of a family sense. And something you do address in your thesis is that fatherhood is not specifically tied to being only a biological father, and that all men are called to be fathers. So my plan is to have a couple of different people on the show to talk about fatherhood from a couple of different angles. But then I realized you wrote your thesis on fatherhood, and Brian also wrote his thesis on fatherhood. And so just kind of an interesting, and I read over both of them, and very, very interesting and unique ways to approach it that I think most people, maybe even in the Catholic world, don't think about too often. They think about fatherhood as you need to be a biological father, or maybe you can adopt. But even if you adopt, it's like, yeah, but you're still not biologically the father. But if you look at it from a Catholic, if you look at through the lens of Catholic anthropology and the way that the way that masculinity has been set up and created by God to be, it's very obvious that there are different ways of being a father, and there are particular ways, but then there's also kind of larger ways that you can be a father, and all men are called to that. And so you did a really good job of both of you did a really good job of explaining that in your thesis, and how all men are called to be fathers in a certain sense. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying and introducing your thesis, which before we get into it, I did want to ask, number one, what caused you to want to major in philosophy? And then a follow-up question to that would be, when you decided to major in philosophy, what caused you to want to thesis on fatherhood specifically?
Yeah, so I guess answering the first question, I really hadn't had much exposure to, I had never really taken a class on philosophy. Prior to the summer program at Christendom, I had taken courses that involved philosophical thoughts, philosophical concepts. But again, I hadn't really had that exposure to philosophy per se, I suppose, until coming to Christendom. Honestly, before coming to Christendom, I probably would have said I would probably be a history major, because all growing up, I loved history, still love history. I think that's probably after philosophy, probably my favorite kind of subject matter, I suppose. But I've always, my family can attest, I've always been a question asker, always wanting to know why, figure things out, just understand how things work, kind of why they work the way they work. So I guess I've been kind of naturally inclined towards the philosophical for a lot of my life. And I guess when I was exposed to philosophy as a course, or, as a subject matter, I just really fell in love with the aspect of getting to know reality, getting to know truth, and understanding why things are the way they are. Like, not just knowing that things are a certain way, but kind of understanding why. And I don't know, I've really loved, there's many things that are applicable, and there's many things to just everyday life in philosophy, and there's many things that are just not all that applicable, but are just still really fun to know and understand. I would say, especially after the summer program, I just really came to, better love and appreciate having a whole section, or a whole discipline, I guess, committed to just understanding the why from the non-theological side. Like, I love understanding things theologically, but there's just something that's really appealing to me about knowing things naturally, understanding what we can know just simply by the light of our natural reason. And, obviously we have a very strong philosophy department at Christendom, and, with Dr. Cuddeback, Mr. Brown, Dr. Snyder, all those other professors just did a really good job of instilling in me, at least, that love of wonder, that love for seeking truth through our natural reason. And so I just settled on philosophy very early on as the major that I really wanted to pursue at Christendom. But then I guess for going to the second question, fatherhood is kind of something I've always, I guess I would say aspired to. Like, I really wanted to be a father even when I was young. I just always wanted at some point to get married, have kids. So just the idea and concept of fatherhood has always been something kind of close to my heart, just something I've just really loved. And so at Christendom, I think it was honestly at I don't remember what it was, just a bonfire that Mr. Brown was at. I don't remember if it was one of those little bonfire things that he did with Mrs. Hickson maybe one time. I can't remember, but I just had, during our conversation, the idea popped into my head of writing a thesis somehow centered on fatherhood, and then the idea of, I guess, thinking that, well, fatherhood probably is obviously something natural to men. Is it something that men are therefore oriented to? Is, like, men by nature, are they supposed to be fathers? Is that something that's just like they're suited to be fathers, obviously, as opposed to women? And so just kind of, delving into that was something that really struck or piqued my interest. And so talking with Mr. Brown a little bit, I kind of, settled on the idea of writing about fatherhood is the natural end of man, not just something man is particularly suited to, but that is his actual natural end, is to be a father in some sense. So just kind of tying the two, I guess you could say the two of the main loves, I guess, of my life, of, fatherhood and philosophy, and just kind of pulling those two together. So, yeah, that's kind of how I ended up settling on that topic.
Reading through one of the books that you seem to quote, I don't know if it's the most, but you do seem to quote it a lot, is a book called Fatherhood and the Perfection of the Masculine Identity, a Thomistic Account in Light of Contemporary Science by Timothy Fortin. And I looked it up. It's a little bit hard to find.
It's a dissertation, I believe.
Yeah, I think I think I tried to look it up, and it's not in book form, and it was like a PDF that you had to buy, or maybe Christendom has a hard copy or something. But why did you decide to use? I mean, the title of that basically encapsulates exactly what you said you were trying to write on, like the combination of the masculine identity from a philosophical aspect. If it's going to be a philosophical, theological aspect, it may as well be a Thomistic one. So I was just curious if you ran across that, and that was something that, you're like, oh, sweet, this is the source that I'm going to use, or one of the main sources, or if you had no idea that book existed, and then you just started researching and found it, or I guess dissertation, rather.
Yeah, no, actually, so one of the classes I took at Christendom, Philosophy of Masculinity and Femininity by Dr. Flippen, this Timothy Fortin was a source that he used a lot in that course, and just in the readings that we had for classes, I realized there's a lot of material that was kind of pertinent to what I was hoping to write about in my thesis. Cause I think I took that class my junior year, if I'm remembering correctly, so it would have been before I actually really started doing any, really a whole lot of work for the thesis, but I just kind of kept that in the back of my mind for when, the semester came that I actually did write my thesis. So I had a very hard time really finding much online, because we did have like a hard copy that he and some of the other professors would use in the library, but it was a PDF. It wasn't something that had already been I guess, published as a book, at least when I wrote my thesis. But yeah, no, it definitely, I draw a lot on him just because so much of what he's trying to argue, like fundamentally what he's arguing, I think is the same. I guess you could say his thesis statement is more or less the same as my thesis statement.
Okay.
And so arguing that fatherhood is kind of, I don't know, like the end, the telos of the masculine nature, the masculine identity, is something that he draws out in a lot. He does a lot better job drawing it out because obviously it's a 300 or 400 page dissertation. But there were definitely little nuances where I was focusing on things that he wasn't, so I was able to use him as a resource without necessarily just copy and pasting what he had. So
I think the question has to be asked when you write a thesis, really when you write anything, something that's very important is to define terms. But I think specifically with a paper on philosophy or a thesis on philosophy, you have to define the terms, even if it's something that when you say fatherhood, everyone has a definition in their head. Everyone's like, okay, fatherhood is the act of being a father. But the problem is everyone's father is different. Everyone has a different relationship with their father. If you're applying fatherhood in the way that God the Father acts, that's going to be different than the way your biological father acts, or your adopted father, or your godfather. So pretty early on in your thesis, you quote Timothy Fortin, and he defines fatherhood as fatherhood refers to the completion of the form in the thing generated. The perfection of fatherhood, therefore, would refer to the completion of a more perfect generation. For example, a generation in which the generated is perfectly conformed to the father. Fatherhood signifies the relationship of the generator to the generated. And you explain that by saying it seems to be that the end of fatherhood is twofold. A father both seeks to form a being like himself and brings that being which he has formed to the fulfillment of its nature, which I hadn't really thought about before. But would you mind kind of expounding on that a little bit? Just the idea of fatherhood not only is merely generating, like just the act of generation that you would see, like in animals, for example. Like there's a father, a child or a baby is generated, but it takes it a step further, and it's also bringing that being which was generated to the completion of its nature.
Which is also really interesting too, because that is in total contrast to what the society is like, the thought about fatherhood even now, like with like contraception and like just across the board, that's making it so that like or even culture now, it seems like contraception is taking away that creative aspect, but then also even when there is that creative aspect, then there's abortion, and it's like this was a one-time thing, we don't want the child, so like let's get, and like that's a terrible thing, but that is really cool that it is both aspects in total contrast. I just thought of that. So
no, I think just kind of, I don't know, unpacking that a little bit. Obviously the physical generation is very important in the whole fatherhood, or with fatherhood and all that. But definitely, I think I definitely mentioned this in my thesis, that the second aspect of fatherhood is the bringing to fulfillment, or the forming, I suppose, of the generated, of the offspring, to be, basically to attain to its full flourishing as an individual. That is honestly, I think, the more important of the two aspects to fatherhood, because really, if you think about it, just kind of practically lived out, the people who are understood to be good fathers are not thought of as necessarily procreating. Like, obviously, I mentioned in my thesis, there's many great saints who never had any children of their own, and yet we, like St. Vincent de Paul or John Bosco, that were incredible father figures, and yet still never had any offspring of their own. And if you look at somebody and say, well, that man really was not a good father, you're not normally thinking, oh, they had ugly children. I mean, maybe that was part of it. I don't know. But, but you think they did a very poor job or just didn't do any kind of job raising their children well, or they neglected their family. And so when we talk about fatherhood, really that formative, protective, kind of nurturing aspect is, I guess, the most important. So
so we can kind of circle back to this point later if it comes up naturally, but I just wanted to, I guess, because it's on my mind, I wanted to make the point, but I don't want to do it and distract from the conversation. But there's a pretty popular mantra, maybe that's the right word, where when in Catholicism, I think pretty specifically when we talk about fatherhood, we talk about protecting and providing, and that's something that a lot of people will refer back to. Okay, well, you need to protect your family and provide for your family, and I don't think that they invented this, but there's a book I was reading by Adam Minahan and David Niles called "Living Beyond Sunday," which is a book they wrote last year through Ascension, and there's a section on fatherhood in there. Because they're talking about creating a Catholic culture in your family and family traditions and things like that, and how important it is for the father to be the head of the household, how important that is, and how necessary that is. So they talk about protecting and providing, but they kind of go one step further and say that a really important aspect of fatherhood, which is kind of the unspoken aspect, is establishing. And so they're like, yeah, obviously you need to protect your family from danger. Although nowadays that may not be a physical danger, but it might be the internet, or it might be online bullying, or bad influence. If you have friends who are a bad influence on your children, you need to prioritize your children, things like that. And then providing, that's usually the pretty basic one. Like even people who are divorced or don't have a good relationship with their dad, a lot of times the dad still has to pay alimony or is still providing for his kids in some way. Obviously, it extends much beyond that, but, like providing them with education of the faith and things like that. But I really like how they brought up the point of establishing, because it's not just saying, here is money, you won't starve. And it's not just saying, if there is a bad person walking at you, I will get you out of harm's way. It's also saying, I'm doing these things to kind of, to your point, to fulfill your nature. Like, you are a child, you will be an adult. I need to protect and provide for you, but the end is to establish, so that you can establish yourself in society. So if it's with a daughter, it's so that you know what a good man looks like, so that you can find someone who will protect and provide and establish. And if it's a son, it's, I'm protecting and providing for you so that you can do the same thing. I'm giving you a model, but it's not just checking off the boxes of you're out of harm's way and you have food. It's also saying, here is like concretely, here's how you handle this situation. Here is how, you like men take care of XYZ. Here is how to do it practically. And I think that a lot of fathers nowadays, a lot of fathers in today's culture see fatherhood as boxes to check. And it's like, well, they have food, they have shelter, and maybe they're, I'm paying for their school, and I go to their soccer games, but it's still kind of a, it's a checkbook. But really you have to look at it as like, no, your child is growing, and they need to have like food, shelter, and love, but they also need to be given a path. They need to be shown the vision of what living the good life, what living Catholicism looks like practically. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of fathers either don't do that, or they want to do that and they don't know how. So anyway, I don't want to sidetrack too much. I just thought that exactly what you're saying kind of reflects what they're talking about in the book, where you need to take it a step further, and Catholicism kind of has the answer to that. And you can even find that just in philosophy. Like, what is it? Just looking at the natural end of man, what does being a father mean? And when you compare that to God the Father and how he provides and establishes his church and all of those things, it's really beautiful. So
and also just with even, I mean, as you said, the checking of boxes, like providing for them. Oh, they're eating. Oh, they're like, they have clothes, and like they're going to school. It also just, although you're going to be with it seems as though you're going to be with your children all the time, obviously, because they're going to be with you and your wife. But then, and so you're going to be just checking a lot of the time, checking off boxes, because it's like, okay, yeah, we have to do this and we have to make sure this is good. But the formation part is, as honestly, as we've seen even at Christendom, like, it's not just something that you can, not just something you can check your box off for, like going to mass, the Catholic peer pressure at Christendom, like going to mass because it's so easy to, obviously, is a really good thing, and you should be in that's a really good peer pressure to have. But there's also that step further of even just like personally, like, okay, no, I actually want to do this. I want to choose this, and that's like that formation part. And so it just makes me think with like. And yeah, this may be a little sidetracked, even a little further away from what we're talking about, but just like prayer life of our children, and like and obviously our babies are still in utero, and your baby is only like just over or like right around 1 year old, so it's like not even really at that point yet, but just thinking,
you can still bring her hunting.
This is, well, no, true, exactly. But just like with, like, we have to be able to show them that, like, okay, this is what to pray. But then we also have to show them this is how to pray also. Just like, not just, all right, I said my Hail Mary for the day, or I said my one decade for the day, and then that's it. Or like, I'm going to mass, but it's really like I'm like begrudgingly going, or I'm begrudgingly doing this thing. Like, the formation part is such a large part, and it goes literally into everything that we do every day, which really does just like really up the ante. Like, like getting it right is so big, and it is hard. And so, like, we have a crisis in masculinity and crisis in fatherhood to a degree that obviously is like, okay, people are failing, but it's also like, that's going to happen, unfortunately, but we just have to be able to like keep trying. And I think the kind of the drop off is the lack of trying. Like, so yeah, I don't know, just in the world. So
and I think you do address this in your thesis, if I remember correctly, the crisis of fatherhood, and you talk about how family trees are changed, and how a community and how a family is affected by the presence or lack of the presence or the lack of the father's presence, and how that radically, I think John Paul II talks about, like, as the family goes, so goes the nation, and so goes the rest of the world. But I think you could extend that to as fatherhood goes, so goes the family. Because if the father is supposed to be the head of the household, and he's never home with the kids, and maybe he's protecting and providing kind of in the general sense, but not spending time with his family, not bringing his family to mass, it's like, that's one of the biggest reasons that that families, I think, fall away from the faith, is that the father stops practicing. And I think there was a stat I was reading, if the father continues to practice, or at least go to mass, even if he's not Catholic, but he goes to mass and makes that an important part of your week, is Sunday mass. I think it's somewhere in the 80 percentile, or in the 80s, that the children will stay Catholic. But if the father doesn't, it's like next to impossible that their kids will continue practicing. Which is so fascinating, that like, because you could be really close with your mom, and she could be very influential, but it doesn't shake out that way. If you look at the data, if your dad stops going to mass, if your dad stops being a good Catholic, the likelihood that you'll continue down that path is incredibly low. And I was scrolling, I'm looking at your thesis right now, and I kind of scroll down, and the next thing that you address is actually how a man is set up to protect, like even just down to the physical constitution of man. So I guess just following the order of your thesis, would you want to speak on that a little bit, and how maybe it's like kind of an overlooked gift that men have been given, and I think in these days it's been kind of blamed on like toxic masculinity and men are abusive and men, men abuse their strength, or they only use it for sports and they don't really put it to good use. But actually, you can even see from Genesis that like God gives man not only the like kind of spiritual authority in the household, but also just kind of a type of physical authority to protect.
No, for sure. I mean, you can just see, obviously we see in our society today, especially just a lot of, I guess what you could almost say is a toxic sort of masculinity, which is, I guess, many things that are evil or simply just distorted things that are at root good things. So, men, like I did address this in my thesis, but there's just studies have shown, and just really a lot of common lived experience shows that by and large men are larger, men are stronger, faster, just more physically capable of handling things that pertain to physical danger. That's just, I guess, naturally how they're wired as well. They'll do things more based on instinct. Like they tend to be more impulsive than women are, which, can certainly get them into trouble. But at the same time, there are instances where if you have to kind of stop and think about things, kind of figure things out, the danger that can be perceived but avoided might, become present. And so just that ability to react quickly, which tends to be more of a masculine trait, is something that can and is helpful for the father as a protector. And then also when it comes to just even the authority side of things, if you're physically weak, it's certainly not as intimidating, or as it doesn't inspire as much respect. Or if you're weak, it certainly doesn't inspire respect in the way that strength does. Obviously, you don't want to necessarily come across as a domineering kind of power, but
like Brian here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I haven't worked out in 3 months.
But, just commanding that physical presence certainly helps to enforce, the who's in charge and who's not in charge. The mom obviously is home typically more with the children than the father is. Just, the father has to go out and work, and so the mother will tend to be home more. And so when he is home, he needs to be able to help show that even though his wife is, in many respects the weaker of the two, he needs to also show his support of her by enforcing what she enforces. And so not just in protecting his children, but also protecting his wife and their marriage and their parental status even in the family. Just having that, the physical strength, just the physical presence, just naturally being stronger, naturally being larger usually than the women, really helps to drive that home.
One of the things I was looking over in my thesis, in it, especially in the context of Jesus in the church. So Ephesians, when St. Paul talks about Christ giving himself up for the church, and then which allows the church to flourish. One of the points that I tried to make was through imitation of Christ in that relationship, man is called to be self-sacrificial for his wife, but then that self-sacrifice allows the wife to be in a place that allows her to flourish. And it sounds very flourish not only as a wife, but also as a person. And then that enables her to become who she's supposed to be, in God's eyes, obviously. But that is, even in a practical sense, with the protecting part, that seems, because obviously it's not just like the bigger part of sacrificing yourself for, like, if she's in danger or your family's in danger, but self-sacrificing as in like working and like making money for your family so that she can have a place where she can flourish, maybe just materially right then, like right on the surface, that leaves, or that gives the foundation for her to further flourish, which is really interesting. Right. Yeah. So that's a really huge, I mean, although it is just a like philosophical, practical, natural thing, that allows for so much. Just that protector.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting because, in a sense, when you're talking about providing for children, you almost tend to exclude your wife in a sense. Like, yeah, you're providing for her, but also she's not as like dependent on you as the kids potentially would be. Sure. But if you think about it in a more philosophical way, even though theoretically, worst comes to worst, she could still go get a job and she could still do those things. Your role is not to belittle her and say that you can't do these things or I don't want you to do these things. It's really more saying, I'm going to go do these things so that you don't have to. And I'm also providing a context in which you can take care of our children in a safe environment with enough money for food and for clothing and for shelter. And I'm allowing you, I'm almost giving you a space to become a better person. Right. And I'm not forcing you to be a better person, but I'm setting you up for success. And I feel like when I think about it, I always think about it doing that for children, right? Like I'm giving you this home and I'm giving you education and I'm giving you, and it's all like, I'm setting you up to become an adult. But I think you could almost apply the same thing to your wife in a sense. Obviously it's a bit different, but you're saying I'm giving you I'm providing this context where you can flourish. Right. And you can walk, you don't have to take that, and you could probably go out and still do great things and have a job, and all of those things can be true, but I'm providing you kind of like a baseline level of protection and a baseline, almost like just kind of a context in which you can pursue the things that you want to pursue in the household, right, depending on what that looks like. And that's not a universal solution for everyone, because obviously, like, you have households where the men stay home and the women go work, or you have a household where they both work, or you aren't able to have children, and so you're not at home that much anyway. But I still think it still can be applied kind of in the general sense of, as a man, you set up the house and you set up the way that you want to live your life so that your wife could do that, regardless of whether you have children or not. It's a safe environment. It's a place where she can make your house, which actually I think Cutterback said this one time, and I really liked it. He was like, men, you can build a house. You could build the entire thing yourself. All from scratch, everything. You do everything, and at the end of the day, it's still just a house. But then if you get married and your wife moves in, then it becomes a home. And he was like, in kind of a real sense, even if you live there, like you're a single guy, you build a house, you live there, it's not really a home. Right. Because let's face it, it's going to look way better once she comes in and redoes everything. Right.
And how much time are you actually going to be spending there? Either too, right, you're probably going to be going out hanging out with people. Or
yeah, like, I don't want to. This place is a dump. Like,
I wake up,
we're living in a hole. Yeah, but I thought that was interesting, where he was like, even on a physical, like, the physical application is you create this house, but it's just a structure, and then your wife will come in and make it a home, right, through a bunch of different ways. Like, there's a bunch of different ways that'll be true. But it seems like that kind of that view in just a physical sense can also be applied in a spiritual sense, where like you can set your wife up in this certain context where she can flourish. Right. So yeah, and you definitely address that, and you talk about how I actually really like you quote a country song in here by Rodney Atkins called "Watching You," and
great song.
Before I read that far, you were talking about how, like, primarily children imitate their fathers, which ties back into low church attendance and people falling away from the faith, because children tend to duplicate and copy what their fathers do. And so the entire song, I'm not going to read the lyrics, but the entire song, it's called "Watching You," and it's about the beginning of the song. The father, I think he runs a red light and he cusses, and then later he hears his son use that word. And he's like, I'm a failure. I haven't been a good father. I need to be better. And then as the song goes on, later he sees his son praying and like copying his dad in that way. And then he feels a little bit better about himself, and the boy's like, yeah, I've been watching you and I've been copying you. Isn't it cool? And in the first verse, it's like, yeah, I'm saying all these words that you're saying. And the dad's like, oh no, you can't say that word. It's a bad word. But then later on his own, he's praying. And so then the dad is like, oh, okay, I have taught him something. And he is copying me in every way, the good and the bad. So yeah, it's kind of an encouraging song. It's
sure.
a bit of a redemptive song, but
I'll have to listen to that again because I do remember that song.
We could make we'll make it the opening music to the podcast.
Go.
You have to listen to it to get to the podcast.
Yeah. The whole song. Like, it's
Yeah,
not
the
just
entire song.
It's not just a part of it. It's the whole.
Yeah. So I guess the next part that I want to talk about is after like protecting and providing, then you get into establishing, but you talk about God the Father, and then you also kind of specifically apply it to Saint Joseph, which if you're going to apply fatherhood to anyone, obviously you're going to apply that to Saint Joseph. What caused you to, what kind of drew you to write on Saint Joseph, like, and to include him? To me, it seems like an obvious thing. Like, if you're going to talk about fatherhood, obviously you're going to use the example of Saint Joseph, but you could also, there's lots of other good fathers you could talk about, or you could just talk about God the Father and keep it way more theological. So, I'm curious why you decided to do that, and then, I guess there's some potential pitfalls that you'd have to address before you can get into it, because if you say fatherhood needs to be like, here, act like Saint Joseph, it's like we don't have any recorded words from him. So what does he say? Does that mean that you need to be quiet, or does that mean that there was a bunch of things and conversations that were recorded, but we never got that? We don't know what that looks like, or I guess rather that weren't recorded. We don't know what that looks like. And then the same thing with God the Father. Like, we have very limited exposure to what God the Father says. So really all you have are the actions, or you have, if Mary was a virgin, or obviously Mary was, but if you go under if you approach it from saying, okay, if she was a virgin, how would have Saint Joseph had to have acted his entire life to be able to preserve that? So it's almost like it's not explicitly stated, but implicitly you can draw these things out from Saint Joseph. So I guess that's another long way of asking, why did you rely on Saint Joseph?
I guess there are probably a few reasons. Obviously, he's a great example of fatherhood. Obviously, there'll be some things you need to address, as you mentioned, in regard to that, because there's so many dissimilarities between his fatherhood and really any other father that ever existed. I mean, no other human can claim to be the father or foster father of God, or to have been married to a woman who was sinless her entire life. So obviously that'll be a very different experience than for really any other father that has ever lived. But I don't know, St. Joseph has definitely been a kind of a favorite saint, I guess, of mine. Just for a long time, he's my dad's name is Joseph, and my middle name's Joseph, so he's a saint I kind of grew up with in that respect. But then I think the year I wrote my thesis was also the year of St. Joseph, just like the year where the church had or the Pope had dedicated that year specifically to him. But then, just as a father, as a man, he really, I think, shows or embodies what it is to be a good, virtuous, faithful man, husband, father. I guess just briefly, you mentioned he doesn't have any words recorded in Scripture. There's no recorded words that he ever spoke in Scripture. He was a man of action. Like, all that we see of him is him doing. And so I think, obviously, what people say is very important, but I think it's almost more important, especially as somebody who's trying to provide an example, to be a person of action. I mean, words are empty unless they're backed up by action. So really, you can tell what kind of person anyone is by what they do. I mean, because, anybody can say, I'll do this, I'll do that, I won't do this, I won't do that. But unless they actually do this or that, or don't do this or don't do that, what they've said really is in a sense kind of meaningless. And so I think I guess it almost points in a way to an important aspect that he's a really good person to emulate, to be a good father, and that, when God asked of him certain things, to be the father of his son, to be the protector of his mother, to be, just kind of that guardian, that protector, that provider, Scripture records that he obeys immediately, does whatever is necessary to, flee to Egypt to get his son and his out of danger from King Herod, And so I think that's a very important aspect that we can see in St. Joseph, that, any man, especially all of us, I guess you could say normal fathers that have more or less a normal, we're fallen men living, married to a fallen woman with fallen children. It's kind of the usual fatherhood experience is in that kind of environment. And so those sorts of things, the action, doing what is right, not necessarily just saying things, is very important to emulate. And then, I don't know, I guess you can easily say that, well, yeah, Christ was perfect, and so what need did he have of being taught? So why should I, as a father, try to emulate St. Joseph, who you could almost say just had it so easy in that regard? Again, there's many things that I just don't know when it comes to what did Christ actually know, what did he have to learn. I think, that's just not something I'm the most familiar with. But what we do know for sure is that when it came to physical things, he had to learn how to be a carpenter. His experience as God still allowed for him as a man to learn how to live as a human, because though he created man, this was the first time you could say that God was man, and so he still had to learn how to live as a human being would in society, to provide for himself, and then when St. Joseph died, to provide for his mother. So he provided a good example to the lived practical experiences of human life, which are still, very essential to any father training their children, especially their sons, to be, flourishing adults. Because one of the things that's necessary for a man is to be able to provide, and in order to provide, he has to have some kind of physical knowledge, some kind of physical experience upon which he can rely to then provide for his family. And then so he just provides a really good example of a good father and a good husband, even though there are many dissimilarities, I think, between him and the rest of our own fatherhood experiences.
I wonder if part of the reason that there's confusion about kind of how to be a father, obviously kind of the first step is whether you had someone you would consider to be a good father in your life, whether it's your biological father or like a role model or something. And if you don't have that, that becomes very obvious as to why that would skew your view of what fatherhood should be or how to be a father. But I'm curious, kind of in the Catholic world, if there's confusion about how to emulate fatherhood, because we have all these examples of it, but they're all kind of different from the universal experience, right? Because you have Saint Joseph, who obviously was a righteous man, right? That's what the scriptures refer to him as a righteous man. So you're like, okay, well, he's already holy. Then he's asked to be the foster father of God. So already he's like been given this awesome gift that I can't even comprehend. Then extended to that, he's not even a biological father. So he's an adopted father of the God-man whose spouse is the Mary. It's like, okay, I mean, obviously that's like, yes, that is something to emulate, but it's almost difficult to even put yourself in a scenario where you're married to the perfect woman and your child is God. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there can be some confusion about how to even emulate that, because you're like, okay, he must have just been given some incredible graces and was just a very patient, kind, righteous person who was obviously always wrong, and so he had to have a lot of humility. So you're like, I don't even know how to identify with that. And then the other examples that we have are God the Father, who you just see as the Old Testament God of justice, and that's difficult to, like, I mean, I guess in a disciplinarian way, you can kind of see where God the Father and the justice and kind of the strength and power of God, you see that, but it's still kind of distant. So then the most personal, like, relationship we have that we're all called to strive to be, like, we're all called to become like Christ, wasn't married and didn't have biological children. So then you're like, okay, well, so then all of a sudden fatherhood, it's like you have this spiritual, like you have the deity, you have God the Father, who you just see up in heaven is like, you know, a big white beard and is like the Old Testament Bible, or the Old Testament God who walks with Adam and Eve, who's in the burning bush, who, you know, that's difficult to relate to. It's difficult to relate to Saint Joseph because, number one, we don't know that much about him, but he also wasn't a biological father and was married to a perfect creation. And then you have Jesus, who wasn't a father, at least in the way that we would define fatherhood, but obviously all of those people are, like, they perfectly encapsulate fatherhood. So it's interesting because you almost have to look at those three figures and then say, what about them is like universally true, and then how do we apply that to people who are biological fathers, or how do we apply that to being a father? And I think, you know, maybe if you have an adopted child, you can identify with Saint Joseph more because it's someone who's not your biological child, but that you've been entrusted to take care of. So maybe obviously there are different ways of looking at that, but yeah, I don't know. It always kind of strikes me as fascinating when you're talking about fatherhood, and there's, of course, tons of good examples of good fathers and saints who are good fathers, but like the three that come to mind are it's a totally different set of circumstances from all three of those, and it's not the universal circumstance that most men find themselves in.
No, I mean, I guess that kind of speaks to, you know, just the fact that our Lord, God the Father, and I guess God the Father in a sense is, in this sense, more like to other fathers in Saint Joseph or our Lord, in that he did beget from all eternity the Son, mm-hmm. whereas in Saint Joseph there was no actual, I guess, begetting of another. But I guess it kind of still speaks to the point that fatherhood, there's multiple ends to fatherhood, and, you know, there's you can have multiple ends within one in one thing. You know, there's higher ends and lower ends, and the physical begetting, the physical generation of offspring satisfies kind of that lower natural end of the continuation of the species, and that kind of aligns more with our animal nature, kind of, you know, along the same lines as really any of the other lower animals. They simply need to reproduce for, you know, just to be able to survive as a species. But then because man has that higher rational nature, that end also needs to be fulfilled, and because that is sort of a higher end, if you want to, you know, think of it on some sort of scale. The lower end is, you know, the physical, the higher is the intellectual, the spiritual aspect. That because that is the higher part of our nature, then it is kind of a higher end and a higher good to help form other humans in that higher sense. And so really, I guess, you know, you wouldn't call any male animal a father just because it has offspring, but you would call a person who helps to provide, you know, helps to bring a being to flourishing a father, again, especially even those that don't have offspring. Because, yeah, again, just that ordering of ends, that ordering of the lower and the ordering to the higher, there is still, you know, a more important and a less important, a more essential and a less essential aspect to that fatherhood.
Yeah, and I guess it just made me think, because you brought up God the Father in the Old Testament, and recently, I don't know if you guys have ever watched A Man Who Would Be King. It's a Rudyard Kipling novel.
Okay.
And I 2 days ago, I watched it with guys at the office after work. And in it I won't go into it, but it's in, I won't go in super long detail, but it's in like the late 1800s, and these two guys go into, I guess, modern day Afghanistan. And they have this whole journey, and then they go, and their plan is to, I mean, it's pretty selfish. Their plan is to to help a tribe take over Afghanistan, and then like usurp the king and become the king.
Nice.
So it's like this whole, it's this whole thing. And so I watched it for the first time, but what struck me, and what it is continually like, my mind goes to, literally the whole time when they're in Afghanistan, you like really see the pagan culture like that, like that's what they're around. And I mean, realistically, these are uncivilized people. And so they, like it made me think, that's what my mind has gone to when I've been thinking about the movie since then. And then it makes me think of the Old Testament. And we're talking about formation, but then also talking about God the Father. So the whole Old Testament is God the Father trying to form Israel out of pagandom, really. The whole time, like they're always going back to, like, first it's Egypt, then the Assyrians, Babylon, Persia, like it's all of them. And every single time he's trying to uproot the vice. Like one of the big like pagan gods that comes up a lot is Moloch in the Old Testament, and my understanding is that he was depicted as a bull, and whenever it was made, it was like a brass or bronze bull, and there was a fire pit under it, and they would literally sacrifice children to like they would put the children in the bowl, like they had like an opening, and they would put it in the bowl, and so they would sacrifice children to this god, and that was like the only way to sacrifice to this god, and that was a really prevalent thing. But sorry, this
is really interesting.
But no, I feel like I could have been, but it can be. I feel like when we are thinking about the Old Testament, and especially the modern culture brings up, like, how could God kill the whole world, like by flooding the world, or how could he like massacre the people at Mount Sinai, or like when the golden calf, and all this stuff. But then when you, like, even at a macro level, you're looking at the Old Testament, and all of it is God trying to form Israel, the people of Israel, into like his children. So like following his will and everything. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, like, it just makes me think of how merciful we are called to be. Mm-hmm. Because if we're supposed to be imitating God the Father, even if we don't have like a great understanding of the Old Testament, but like even just the New Testament, he sent his son to die for us, for our sins, so that we could become children. Mm-hmm. And like, not slaves, but adopted sons. Like, even just in that, like, we're almost just in awe of, like, we can do so many bad things as people, but like he's still calling us to be better, and that's like that's what we're supposed to be doing as fathers to our children, like no matter how much. It's kind of, I don't know, it just made me think, like, we're not called to have perfect children. Like I mean, we want to have good
Speak
people.
for yourself.
Well, like, no, I just think, like, practically, like, your children are just not going to be perfect. And like, there are families where you're like, wow, those parents are just like, those kids are so good in math, or like blah blah blah. But then like most of the time it's like kind of like after 7-year-old, like like upwards of 7 years old that you're kind of like, wow, they're actually like doing really well in mass or something like that. And that's been 10 years of their parents trying to like get them to sit still or like get them to like, okay, like see what's happening in mass. So I don't know. I just feel like there, it is such a high call, and we have to do our best, because like the formation of our child is dependent on this. But then it's also like freeing too, because we, as much as we'll fail as fathers, like they're still, as long as we keep trying and like are still trying to be like not the overbearing abusive father, but like we are trying to form them in good habits, like it's going to stick somewhere. And even if like, I feel like with families, you kind of, it's really terrible when, I just feel like the devil's always trying to go after families, because there's always big families. It always seems like there's like one or two children who are kind of just like I don't like it's in I guess in not my particular family, but even then, but like broader like extended family, you just like see big families and you're just like like all these like you really look up to these aunts and uncles, but then there are others that you're just kind of like, oh man, like we got the same formation, the same thing, and others took it, and others kind of gave it up,
rejected it.
Yeah. And so like that's like I God forbid that happens, but like almost like there's only so much we can do, kind of thing.
Well, that's why I feel like the story of the prodigal son is so beautiful to kind of reflect on, because you think about how they're both basically given the same thing, and there's all kinds of different jealousy going on and different decisions that are being made, and at the end of it, the son who goes and squanders everything and casts his pearls before swine, and does all of the unspeakable, unimaginable things. Then the father sees him in the distance and is like, we're going to throw the biggest party, put a ring on his finger and a cloak around him. And then there's a lot of different really awesome depictions of paintings, and the father is just like encompassing this, it's like the lost sheep, right? Like the 99 are faithful, but God the Father, or even I'm sure most actual biological fathers, you're going to go get the one that's astray, and that's the one that you're going to fast for or sacrifice for, or and there's kind of there's that constant call to come back,
right?
It's so beautiful to see that. It's just a parable, but to see that, and obviously it's Christ talking about sinners who are astray, that like you've been redeemed, Christ has died for you, and he's going to keep knocking, he's going to keep calling you. And I think that as fathers, we have the exact same commission given to us of like your wife, your children, even your friends, like because I think there's even an aspect of fatherhood that extends to not being a father to your friends, but being a good father to your friends who are fathers, and showing your friends how to be a good father, and to be that person who is protecting and providing for them, like not just for your immediate family, but for your friends, and showing them like this is what it means to be a good man, this is what it means to be a good brother, or a good son, a good uncle, godfather, actual father, and if you don't have that, I think it's very easy for men to feel isolated and feel attacked and feel almost like not worthy of the role that you've been gifted with. But if you can surround yourself, and I think this kind of might be a good place to end it, but if you can surround yourself in a good community, or create that community if you don't have one, that is the only way that you're going to be able to change your family and be able to change the church, and to be able to be a cause of good change in the world. It's not going to be big picture necessarily, and I don't think pretty much no one is called to be like the huge major speaker who's running a multi-billion-dollar company. For some people that will be your calling, but I want to say it's Chesterton, but I don't know. Chesterton is misquoted so often. But I think he has a saying in one of his articles, and he says that there's nothing so extraordinary as an ordinary man, like working an ordinary job, going home to an ordinary family, and like talking to his ordinary wife and playing with his ordinary kids, something to that effect. And regardless of whether that's Chesterton, or even if that's remotely close to what he said. It's true. Like there is something fundamentally, and that's not saying that person isn't, or that father isn't doing great things, but it's almost like you can make these ordinary things extraordinary if you're. It's like it's kind of goes back to the like the little way, right? You can do ordinary things with extraordinary love, and so I think that having that hope that even if you feel like you're doing nothing and you're not building bridges and you're not building skyscrapers and you're not doing these big awesome things, that actually what you're doing by protecting and providing and establishing is in the long run far more important. And the fact that you just keep continually trying to do that is what you're called to do. And that breaks down in a lot of different ways. But I think that, I think it's a good message of hope. So on that note, I don't want to take up any more of your time, Anthony, because I know that you have all these other podcasts that you're getting to while you're in town, conventions and speaking gigs.
Yeah. Again, there's no wedding though.
And I hate that this is a little bit short, because I feel like we can't really do the topic of fatherhood justice, but I think it's okay because there's so many different ways to approach it, and there's so many different resources and books and podcasts and things that people can go listen to. I want to think of this as kind of like the beginning of a conversation that hopefully you can come back on and talk about more, or we can have other people on to talk about more and try to dig in a little bit deeper. But on a closing note, is there anything that you would kind of recommend to all of our listeners? I think there are a lot of the people that listen to this, I like kind of guilt trip them into listening to it. Like I'll send them episodes that I want them to listen to, and a lot of them are just my guy friends, and so I would be.
It's the start.
It's the start. It's how you change the world, one podcast at a time. But I would be curious if you had any kind of words of wisdom as a young husband and father to people who are, maybe haven't. Sorry, totally lost my train of thought. Let's start over. Any words of wisdom for people who maybe aren't even married, just guys who are out in the world, single, working, or even two guys who are married and have kids on the way. Just a couple practical things that you've either learned from wise men in your life, or that you've kind of picked up along the way, maybe through your thesis research and other things. Just a few practical tips.
Yeah, I think certainly one of the things that comes to mind for me that I think would probably be applicable to really any guy, regardless of his station in life, is, you're always, and I don't want to sound bad, I suppose, but you're always being watched. You're always giving some sort of example to whoever's around you, whether that's for good or for bad. And so, even if that's not necessarily even people that are younger than you, I work with people that are a lot older than me, and they'll sometimes comment on how they notice I do things or don't do things. For example, a lot of my coworkers are either nominally Catholic or no Catholics, and so they're, slightly familiar with Catholicism and some of the practices, especially with just coming out of Lent. And so, they'll ask questions or they'll make comments. So they'll just be like, oh, that's kind of cool that you're doing that. Because, they'll be like, there's a lot of people in my life that are Catholic, but it's just, you might as well, you could be Catholic, you could be Protestant. It's just like, whatever, not really a big deal. But, for them, seeing that I am Catholic and that I am, striving to practice even in the work environment, I know that I don't know necessarily what that impact is, and I may never know, this side of heaven what that impact will be. But I guess it's just important to realize that even when you don't realize it, people are watching you. You are setting an example, and so just trying to live a holy life, not just for your own sake, but for the sake of others, is very important. And again, just being a good man really goes a long way, and it's not just as simple as, he's dependable, he's reliable, that I'll ask him to do things because I know he'll get things done, but also just providing that inspiration to other guys who may not necessarily be there, or who struggle with guys in their own life, whether it be fathers or, just other friends, just providing that positive a positive male encounter is really important for helping to, I guess, restore manhood, restore fatherhood to, its lost status of, being a place of honor in society, a place of honor in the family, and just helping to restore the world for Christ. I don't know, I guess that's kind of the big thing. Just men are created for activity, and so just being a man of good action is just very important.
Let's go.
Lechugava.
Darn right.
Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
is that Spanish for let's go?
No, it's Spanish for lettuce, like lettuce. And
that makes more sense.
And then it just, sorry, last note. Vamos just doesn't sound as fun as Lechugava. Come on.
Lechuga vamos?
No, just vamos, because vamos is let's go.
Why haven't we been saying vamos this
Because Lechugava is just funnier.
That's true. It does have a pun. That's something essential, I think, to being a good man.
Yeah.
Not even
learn
fatherhood.
puns.
You got
Bad
to.
jokes
You
are
have to think in. You have to think in puns. Yeah. All right. On that note, we'll close out the episode here. Anthony, thanks for coming on, and we're looking forward to having you back on. Currently, you hold the record for traveling the furthest for our podcast. So, for anyone who's on the West Coast, this is a challenge. Just call us. Yeah, we'll have you on. I don't care who you are. If you're from California, well, actually, if you're from California, don't call. But yeah. All right, this is Doing Virtue,
a Catholic podcast
where virtue is what we do. Cheers. Welcome back to the podcast. We just recorded with our good friend Anthony VanAlstine, and we are going to talk for a few more minutes because Brian really is passionate about the topic of fatherhood, and
let's go.
We just decided to record a little bit more. So you can enjoy this bonus content in the future. This may be only available to our close friends, but for now, we don't have any close friends, and it's just available to whoever's listening to this. So we hope you enjoy. Brian, take it away.
All right. So, with my, we were talking about fatherhood in that whole episode, and just like through philosophy, the practicality of the practical notions of fatherhood. So protector, provider, and through that obviously, that shows the supernatural calling of fathers. And so in my thesis, I was a theology major, and I went through just kind of theology of the body, Imago Dei, what that looks like, just the rational nature of man, and that shows the creative nature of God, or who we are imaging. So obviously the image. So that's we take on the creative nature of God, and then also he imprints his picture on us. And then next went to Ephesians and what that looks like with Christ in the church, and how man and woman really, the mystery of man and woman is opened up more so through Christ in the church, but also through each other. And then finally, it was about God the Father. So how Christ reveals God the Father, and and so there was just one little thing that I wanted to read, because it really, every time I think about my thesis, but then this topic in general really brings to mind. So I'll just read it for you. It's in the quote is from a short story by Carol Hauslander. And the short story is this priest going to a family friend who is bedridden and who has fallen away from the faith, and he's explaining. He pretty much there's this really cool quote that he pretty much explains God the Father. So I'm just going to read it. And so firstly, Carol Hauslander puts God's love as extravagant, almost prolific. And then I'll just read the quote. So Father McGrady is the priest, and he says, Look at all the countless millions of seeds wasted that one take root to be a tree for us. You see, Fernandez, all creation is only one thing: a father clothing and feeding, delighting his child, and saying again and again in everything, I am your father. I love you. Yeah, every time I I look or I think about my thesis, I think of that. But it's really, obviously, like if you just think about all the beautiful things that of the world that God created, and we are obviously the pinnacle of it, and we're called to enjoy it, in the best ways. All the things God created are good, so we're called to do that. And so like a sunset, the beauty of the fall, of the trees, the colors of the trees, especially out in Front Royal, all of that is like, and that comes in cycles, and so we see it every year. But it's really these tiny little things, the change of colors that God wants us to notice, and then it's supposed to bring us back up to Him. So if it doesn't, then no, it's not a bad thing, because we are supposed to enjoy them within themselves. But we should really be thinking about all that He created, and that He created them for us. Like right. He created us for our own sake, but everything else as an outpouring of Himself, so that we could enjoy, which I just think is just really beautiful.
I think something that comes up a lot in Catholic circles is Catholic guilt. And there is a tendency, I don't know if it's specifically with Catholics, maybe this applies to all Christians, but I really only hear it in the Catholic circle, where we feel guilty enjoying things that are good, and then we start to think maybe we're enjoying it in excess, maybe we're abusing it, maybe and it's good to be prudent. It's good to it's good to be aware that that's a possibility. Like you might enjoy your work, but are you enjoying your work so much that you're neglecting your family? Or you may enjoy a certain book or a TV show, and that it might even be like a really virtuous, like awesome book or a fantastic, really entertaining show. But are you enjoying it at the wrong times? Are you watching it at work when you need to be working? Are you watching it at home when you should be like working on a project or something, or just spending quality time with your friends? And so obviously it's what virtue is. There can be an excess, but there can also be, you can go too far the other way where you don't enjoy those things at all. And so something we talk about in the show a good bit, but I think it's worth reiterating, is that there are so many good things to enjoy in life. And there's actually something, this ties in pretty well with what I'm saying. There's a movement I've heard of recently, and it's I think it's called the Boscoist movement. Is that right? I think that's how you pronounce it. And it's not really a real like church movement. Like there's not like bishops that are promoting this, but it's similar to the different ways of living that people will recommend, right? So you kind of have like the agrarian, the Benedictine option, right? Like you get away from everything. You create your own bubble and you don't really break outside of that. And I think we've talked about that a little bit on the show before. There's good and bad involved in that, depending on your background and what you have available to you, because not everyone's called to go buy a farm. Even though I think there's definitely something very good and beautiful to be able to do that, but not everyone has that means. And then you have other options where I was actually listening today. Father Gregory Pine and Father Jacob Bertrand, both who we have had on the show now at this point, were interviewing the great and powerful Scott Hahn, and they were talking about his book on suffering, and it's like the kind of the church militant coming home and all that. And he, in the book, expresses something called the Jeremiah option, which is like accepting the suffering servant, right? Accept like that suffering is going to come across, and that this is part of your cross, and not just complaining about it. So along those lines, I think there's kind of other movements in the church that probably aren't as popular as that, but one of them is following upon what John Bosco would tell his boys, and he would say, like, don't sin, and then do whatever you want. And there's a beautiful simplicity to that, because if you're doing whatever you want, that may involve sin. But if part of that command is to, number one, don't sin, and then you can do whatever you want, it's kind of this freeing. Right. I guess you could look at it as slavery in some sense, where you feel like, well, what if what I want to do is a sin, or what if I don't know it's a sin, and you can get overly scrupulous, and there's a lot of different rabbit holes you could go down with that particular way of thinking. But I think that the important thing to focus on with that is all that we're called to do. And I don't think it should be viewed in a minimalist way, like, don't commit mortal sin and then you're fine. Obviously, there's a perfection that we're striving for, but there's also the kind of a divine simplicity there where it's, don't sin. And then everything else that you're doing, if it doesn't involve sin, is a good thing. Right. So if you're drinking and you're drinking to the point of sin, that's a bad thing. But if you're drinking and you're not sinning, then it's a good thing, and it should be encouraged. And so, I think men can be very, in my experience, men can be very cautious of the extremes.
Yeah.
Or rather, they're not cautious of the extremes. They should be cautious of the extremes. So they'll just be like, yeah, well, whenever I drink, I tend to have too much, so I'm just not drinking. And maybe that is the right decision. Maybe that's the prudent decision. But I think a lot of times there's a middle ground where you can enjoy the good things of life and also recognize that there's a balance, right? Like, I don't think that you should smoke 3 cigars a day and inhale, because that's not really prudent. Financially, it's probably not prudent. For your health, it's not prudent. Yeah. But being able to enjoy that, or even if you don't enjoy it, but you're interested in cultivating that is a good thing to pursue. And again, prudence plays into a lot of this, but it just kind of struck me as something that I think men either focus on, what things can I do and I'm going to do them really well, or what things do I need to avoid and all I'm going to do is avoid those things. Right. Like, is this place or this site or this time of day a near occasion of sin? Then I just need to block it out of my mind and work out. And sometimes that is the solution. Like, you just need to get out of, like St. Paul says, you have to run some sins. You can only drive out by fasting and praying and like literally running away from. Right. But I think that there's kind of a bigger message there where you need to be able to also recognize that that's always going to be a part of life, and to not get overly negative about things and just say, okay, you know what? Like, yeah, I have a family now, so I can't live the way that I lived before, but I'm going to set aside time so that I don't feel trapped, and so that I do have prayer time, so that I do have spiritual time, so that I have time with my wife, so I have time with my friends, time with my family, you can make time for all of that. And if you're part of that is discipline, right? Like, being able to be disciplined. And I don't want to grandstand and say that I have it figured out, because I definitely don't. But I think that if you're just starting to think that way, that's the beginning. Like, okay, I want to prioritize these things. How do I do that? Right. So there's a constant struggle of doing that, but it just kind of tying this back in, I think it's a really important thing to reflect on, to think that, like, I just need to not sin, and then everything else is going to be good. Right. And then I think with that, there's a hope, because you can just say, like, the goal, like, men are goal oriented. The goal is to not sin. Okay, so I need to cut out the things that are causing me to sin. I need to avoid situations in which I normally sin. I need to figure out what my sins are and, like, try to, maybe find a saint that's associated with that falling or whatever, and replace that with something good. But then everything else, literally everything else that I'm doing is good. Right. And there's probably a way that I can make it better, but I shouldn't be negative about the fact that, it's good. I have some prayer time. It's like, good. You're not sinning. You're praying. That's good. Right. Could you do a holy hour? Probably. But just because you're not doesn't mean that you're a failure. Like, good, but you're not sinning, and I think that's a good starting point for a lot of guys. So I'll kind of give it back to you. I just wanted to get on a soapbox for a few minutes and talk about that, because it kind of came up, or it came into my mind when we were talking earlier with Anthony, but it didn't really present itself. Sure. I didn't really have an opportunity to make that segue, but what you read made me think of that. And so,
it is. Every time we talk about, like, temperance and everything, just makes me think of Keurig and in class when I don't know why, and I'm not 100% sure. Obviously it was the context of the class, but I don't know exactly what the topic was. But I just remember him saying, and maybe it was just something that St. Thomas talks about a lot, which I know he does, but I just don't know where, is just like the concept of rightly ordering your life. And so all of these things, like we need to be ordering it away from sin. And then, and if we're ordering it away from sin, then we'll be able to do pretty much do whatever we want. Yeah.
Virtue.
Yeah. I can drop the mic now. We're good. All right. Yeah, no, truly. And so we can all, when we give up those sins and we like really, it makes me think of one of the quotes. I don't know which letter of St. Paul it is, but in it he talks about if you see anything beautiful, like, and he goes, and there are a couple more descriptive words, and then he says, anything that's good, think about these things. And then later on in it, he says, it's, or maybe it's a different quote, but it's something to the effect of letting Christ transform our minds. And so, like, even when it comes to, like, stopping pornography or stopping, like, most of the time, you were talking about sins that we just need to run away from. Yeah. Most of the time, St. Paul, but then other saints, the sin that I hear that the most from is lust. And so lust is one of those things that you obviously have to run away from, but that doesn't mean you need to, like, suppress any of it. It's well, I guess suppress the bad, like the bad inclinations, of course, but there's more to be done than just running away from it. Like, there has to be more of, like, literally transforming your mind so you're thinking about women in a better way, or you can I think I've heard a lot of the time, especially the Catholic Man Show talks about it, but then other podcasts just talk about it a lot, when, like, you try and, like, redirect your mind to think, like, okay, God, let me, like, help me look and recognize, like, the beauty that's here. And obviously, if you're looking at pornography, or if you're looking at like anything akin to that, you need to stop. And the beauty is there, but the beauty is not for you to see. Yeah. So you shouldn't even be like at that time. You just need to, like, walk away from it, rather than being like, no, I'm gonna sit here and actually see the beauty in this. Like, that's not the time that you're doing that. So it does take, like, you have to, like, step out of that, but, like, you do have to change. Like, our minds are ordered before grace through concupiscence. And so we have to be able to, like, lean into the grace, so that concupiscence, obviously it's always going to be there, but so that we get further and further away from it.
When you were talking, it made me think of, pretty sure it's Aquinas who talks about how appetite affects vision. And so it's like,
I love that.
It's such a weird thing, because it's like your appetite, which it's partially physical, but a lot of it has to do with your soul, like your repetitive nature. But that actually, and when he talks about vision, he's not talking about, like, the soul being misled. He's talking about, like, almost like physical vision. Right. And so if you've conditioned your soul in a way to, there's many different ways to do it, but I think a primary one and a popular one today is, like, pornography. You've conditioned your soul to objectify women, even if you don't think of it that way. Like, you just think, oh, well, like, who's being hurt here? Like, they're doing this freely. It's free. Like, you are affecting your vision of women, because then you start to see women in that context, and you almost can't see them outside of that context. And then, but it's so, and this could be like a whole nother episode in itself, but something I really like that Jason Everett does, he's a big speaker on, he has a company and website called the Chastity Project, and he talks about this all the time. That Catholicism is really good about condemning the sin, but not always good at encouraging the virtue. Right. Or if they do encourage the virtue, they don't give you a practical way to do that. So he was like, it's not helpful for someone to say, like, stop being lustful. It's like, well, maybe you need that wake up call, but that's ultimately the message is, here's how to be pure. Right. And that's not to say that, that you need to be kind of soft about it. Like, well, let's just focus on virtue. There's no sin. Like, just, no, you can condemn the sin, but rather than just saying, like, sex outside of marriage is bad, and this is bad, and pornography is bad. All of those are true, and you can establish that. But and this is very heavily, it ties back into your thesis, because you talk about man and women, the differences, or men and women, and the differences between men and women that John Paul II talks about in Theology of the Body. And that's what Jason Everett uses for a ton of his stuff. But he talks about, I think he actually is quoting John Paul II saying, when the reason that pornography is wrong is not because you're seeing the human body, like that you're seeing a naked human body. It's not wrong because it's almost like it's not wrong because it's enjoyable. It's wrong because, or rather, pornography is not wrong because it's showing too much. It's wrong because it's not showing enough. Because it's like, yeah, there's a person here, but you're not with them. Right. And if you were with them in this context, it would be wrong. But if you're with them in the correct context, it would be beautiful. And so it's like, it's not wrong that I'm seeing this person's body. It's wrong that I'm seeing it on a screen for someone who I'm not married to. For it, you go down the checklist, and it's so. And I think that's a really good way to contextualize it, where it's like, you're not saying that the human body is bad. You're not saying that like the marital embrace is bad. What you're saying is it's bad in this context. Right. It's bad that you're not committing to this enough. Like, the reason that it's sinful is because you're not going out and finding that woman and marrying her and like doing it the correct way. You're going about it in this cowardly, I'm not going to pursue women in this way, and I just want pleasure. Right. So I think that, again, like I said, this could be a complete other podcast, just talking about either purity or chastity or something like that. But I think something that I think we mentioned this earlier, but we had a cigar night a couple nights ago, and we were talking about isolation and how many guys feel isolated, even if they're surrounded by friends and do stuff constantly, and they're not like they're involved in their community, but they feel isolated. And I think pornography is one of those things, and there's probably a handful of other sins, but I think that one specifically makes people feel really isolated because they feel like no one else struggles with it, or they feel like because they've struggled with it that now they don't know how to develop that pure vision. But it's also hard to talk about because you don't want to be like, oh yeah, I've struggled with this, and it's like that. It is kind of a sensitive, private thing, but at the same time, the only way that you can help other men not feel isolated is to be like, oh yeah, all of us struggle with this thing, all of us struggle with that, and to different degrees. It's not that everyone has been addicted to this particular sin for years. Maybe you've never been affected by it, and like that's great if that's the case. But I think that a lot of different factors play into it. But I think isolation for men specifically, like if you don't have a father figure in your life and you have a hard time like being able to practically live out what the vision is of fatherhood, and then you feel burdened by these sins, and then you feel isolated by them, and then all of a sudden you aren't enjoying things, and like you can't drink and have a good time because you feel like, what if that's sinful? And then you're drinking to make yourself feel better, and it's just all of these things just viciously spiral. And so I think a lot of men just need to take a step back and like, I don't know, like make a good confession. Don't be scrupulous about silly things. Set yourself up for success. Set aside time for prayer. Do something that you enjoy, even if it's not full time. Find a thing that you enjoy, even if it's something you think is silly. Just get into it and enjoy it, and start having like a real, start having a real passion for life. There's nothing as boring as talking to someone who just doesn't have a plan and just doesn't care about anything. Right. Like, it's just, they're the most boring people who are, they're just so, they're all cookie cutter. And I think that's why actually, I think it's John Paul II again, who talks about how the fullness of each person is seen in their development of sainthood. Like in heaven, all of the saints are completely unique and holy in all of these awesome, different, weird, quirky, incredible ways. Yeah. And on earth, all of the sinners are one giant blob. Yeah, they're all doing There's no identification. It's all just passion-oriented, prideful, spiteful, lustful, whatever it is, and it's just all the same. And that's why, and I'm not saying that if you meet a boring person that they're a sinner, but like if you meet someone who just doesn't care about life, doesn't have any passions, doesn't have any goals, is just existing, they're not fun to be around.
Right.
It's fun to be around people who are different from you and are like, especially guys, I think, like when they're just kind of psyched about things. It's fun.
Yeah.
And I don't know where this ties in, but yeah, like just being like, I don't know, like being the friend you want to have. Right. Like, I want a friend. I want him to be this way. I want to be that friend.
Right.
And then putting all that in the context of like, I need to surround myself with good examples, and I need to have accountability, and I need to be like staying busy. And there's a lot of different things that feed into that. But I guess where this ties in is trying to understand our identity as men through God the Father and his revelation to us. And you touch on that in your thesis quite a bit. I guess I'd just be curious as to how that plays out practically.
Yeah. I honestly, I think, and maybe this is a good, I guess.
Sorry, I tried to segue there, but
no, that's totally fine. No, but I think, and it's actually kind of funny because I talked about it in our first episode with the because we were talking about deification, and I watched what is his name? I can't remember his name. He's a Dominican priest, and it was one of the Thomistic Institute lectures, and he was talking about deification, and in it he says the best way that we can imitate God in general, obviously, I mean, when we talk about God the Father, we're talking about God, we're talking about Christ, we're talking about the Holy Spirit, but the best way that we can, and really I think it is, I mean, obviously you see it in Christ's death and resurrection, like he gives himself for us in death and then rises again so that we can rise with him. But that is all an action of the Father. Mm-hmm. Like he sacrifices his own son to like die for us. And so in that video, in that lecture, he says the best way to imitate God is mercy. So,
and I just looked up the name. It's Father Andrew Hofer.
Yes,
is that right?
Hofer.
Dominican priest.
Yep, Dominican priest. Yeah. And so he has a lot other really good stuff, and Dominicans are just great. So you can probably go on Thomistic Institute and just find so many good things. But well, I know you can. But so yeah, with just like, I guess I don't really know. Whenever I think of mercy and I think of the practicality of it, I think of, it was kind of what I was talking about with like our kids, like when our kids are not doing what they're supposed to, and like we're gonna get angry and we're gonna do this. Like, I think mercy and forgiveness, obviously there has to be justice, because without justice you can't have mercy, and without mercy you can't have justice. Like they are, and that's actually, they're so intertwined, so you need to have a standard, but then you also, like, if they fall, like, it's like, yeah, okay, like, you did this, there are consequences to your actions, so here's the consequence. But also, like, I'm not doing this so that just to punish you. Like, I want you to see, and then I want you to see what I'm trying to like get at. But then also, I'm trying to, I forgive you, and this is not like a you're terrible. Like, yeah, we just, like, we all need to be formed. And so, yeah, I don't know, and I think that can be practically lived out in our marriage too, like with our wives, but then, and obviously beginning with that, and then with friends, I think that is kind of like, people can have very harsh opinions about things, and very harsh opinions about you, or about people that you know, or stuff like that, or people that you look up to, and like, yeah, and that can hurt, because you're like, why would you think that way? Or why would you think about this in that way? Like, it seems like such a, like a diminishing way of thinking about things. But like, even in those times, we can really really imitate Christ in those times, to still love them, and like still be like, like, it kind of hurts me that you think this way, and it hurts me that people do think this way, but like, I don't hold it against you, and I still think I do want to try and like get you to think like another way, but sometimes that doesn't happen. Most of the time it happens over a long period of time. It's not like I'm going to say this thing, they change, there we go, here we go, and now we keep moving kind of thing. It's like walking with them to be like, and not being pompous about it, not being like, yeah, you're an idiot. Like, why do you think that way? And maybe you do have to be that way sometimes, but even then, like there's a better way to do that. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of that. Maybe that's not what a theologian would say, but that's my 2 cents, just because of that quote from Father Hofer.
Yeah. Something you mentioned at the beginning, which we're not going to be able to touch on too much, but I just want to briefly circle back to that, is that you mentioned that part of the calling of fathers is to, what we talked about earlier, the protect and provide and then establish. We didn't really talk about establishing that much because there's a lot of different ways that plays out. It kind of in day-to-day life, like what does establishing mean? What does teaching your children how to pray? Like there's a lot of different nuances with that. But something you mentioned on on this segment of the podcast is ordering. And I think that kind of encapsulates what it means to establish, I think, for a father is to to properly order. And that starts with yourself, and then it extends to you and your spouse, and then to your children. Or if you're not married, it's still applicable to order your life in a meaningful way. But yeah, there's something powerful about like the way that God orders creation and the way that the human person is ordered. Like you're ordered to love God, you're created to worship God, and there's all of these instincts that are there by nature. And I think that being fathers, or even just being men, kind of in a broader sense, our role, I think if you had to pick one thing that we're supposed to do, like you can lead and you can protect and but I think that it might be the key thing that men do is order. Like you place order in your household, in your life, in your community, you order things, you organize things, because ordering is part of protecting. Right. How are you going to protect your family? Well, I'm going to set up these different securities and these fallbacks, and I'm going to have weapons, and I'm going to have, and that's kind of in a physical way, but how am I protecting them from, online harm, and how am I protecting them from all of the different things that could cause harm to my family? You have to be organized and on top of that, and that part of that is ordering, and then providing. How am I, financially, career-wise? What does that look like? Well, it's ordering, it's pursuing a goal, and then establishing, like, what do I want my family legacy to be? What do I want people to say when they think of my family? Why are we here? Like, how if the goal is my kids to stay Catholic, how do I encourage that? How do I implement that? So it seems like a lot of it does come down to ordering, and that ties in well with, like, just living the life of virtue in general, is just ordering yourself and figuring out ways that you can improve, and in certain areas where maybe you have kind of an extreme view on this and you need to tone that down, and then other areas you're kind of soft on and you need to, like, be a bit harsher on the fast days or on not eating meat on Friday. Like, you need to pick that up a little bit. So and again, that can be a whole other podcast, and we have Dr. Cuddeback on. Hopefully we can talk about that a little bit, but like that intentionality, that ordering, and how crucial that is to just live the life of virtue for everyone, but specifically for men, how that's kind of like, seems like we have to go above and beyond women in some sense to establish order in our lives and in the lives of our families and our community. Right. So, before we go, one thing I want to say is I think we're going to do a podcast on this in the future, but there's a book by the Catholic Gentleman, and it's called The Catholic Gentleman, Living Authentic Manhood Today by Sam Guzman. And then on the back, there's recommendations, like book blurbs, essentially. And there's like 7 books that are all on manhood and fatherhood that are all good. So one of them is by Jason Craig, and he wrote a book called Leaving Boyhood Behind. There's another book by Father Larry Richards called Be a Man, Becoming the Man God Created You to Be. And then there was one more. I guess the other one isn't specifically about manhood, but Matt Fradd is one of the guys who wrote praise for this book, and he wrote a book called The Porn Myth, and he talks about that. He talks about pornography and fighting that a lot, and then he has a program called Strive 21, I think, which is a detox that you can. Right. I think it's free, and you can. It just goes through, like, if you're actually if you're addicted to it and you're trying to get off it, you can join a community of men anonymously, or you can, I guess, non-anonymously join and be a part of that. So there's a lot of different things there, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of those books, or even hopefully talk to some of the authors in the future. But just if you want some resources,
just as one of those, I guess, tying those names of the books in.
Yeah.
Leave boyhood behind and be a man.
Let's go.
All right.
This is Doing Virtue,
a Catholic podcast,
where virtue is what we try to do. No, or virtue is what we do.
Let's go.
Let's go.